You are listening to Influencers from the Conference Board.
Hello everybody, I'm Ivan Pollard, leader of the Marketing and Communications Centre at the Conference Board. This is our podcast series where we discuss topical and timely issues pertinent for those who tell stories for a living, namely marketing and communications professionals like you. These discussions take place with interesting experts who have different perspectives and through whom we can furnish you with trusted insights for what lies ahead. So first, let me tell you a bit about myself. I was recently the Global Chief Marketing Officer at General Mills, and before that I was with the Coca-Cola Company for 7 years running things like global media, digital sponsorships and content. Now, with me today, I have Christine Moorman, who is the T. Austin Finch Senior Professor of Business Administration at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. Christine is a recognized expert in marketing strategy, marketing measurement, and marketing excellence. She's an author, an editor, and a really nice person. But most importantly, she is the founder and managing director of the CMO Survey. And we're going to talk about the latest results from what is now the 27th edition of this survey. And we're going to see what they tell us about the role of marketing leadership, the evolving responsibilities of a marketer now and into the future, and then also the pressure upon marketers these days to prove their worth to the CEO and the CFO and the board of directors. So Christine, tell us a little about the CMO survey and introduce yourself to us.
Well, thank you, Ivan. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the survey with your listeners. I started the CMO survey in 2008, and to be honest, it was born out of a series of frustrations in the fact that when I noticed news organizations, for example, talking about marketing, they weren't interviewing marketing leaders. They were interviewing CFOs or CEOs. And certainly those parties have a lot to say about the marketplace, but marketers really do have important insights to share about customers and other marketplace dynamics. And so that was one frustration. A second frustration was that marketing leaders were complaining about not having that seat at the table. And yet there really wasn't, at that particular point in time, very good information, very good benchmarks for marketers to think about their spending behaviors or really where they stood in terms of other strategic opportunities and even the way that they think about marketing. And so I started the CMO survey as a way to collect and disseminate the opinions of marketing leaders so that we could really think about tracking marketing excellence with the ultimate goal of improving the value of marketing in companies and in society. And so we've been doing this twice a year since 2008. And it, from what I know and think, it is the longest running non-commercial survey for marketing leaders. And I'm really proud of that and the insights we've been able to offer.
Well, you should be proud of it. As a former CMO myself, I always used to not only read the survey, but take part in it. And considering it was born out of frustration, that's a great story to lead from frustration to something that is wonderful and useful for all of us. And actually, when we think about the survey, as you say, trying to get real data from real marketers that shines a real light on what's going on in the profession. The audience for this podcast is primarily marketing and communications professionals. So let's start with a little bit of good news that the CMO highlighted regarding the leadership role and that seat at the table.
There is good news here. When we ask marketing leaders to report on how the importance of marketing has changed in their companies, we see very consistent reports of an increased level of importance throughout this pandemic period, with 72% of those marketing leaders reporting that marketing has increased in importance during the last year. And this good news continues because we see that marketing's responsibilities have really increased across a range of very important strategic activities. For example, marketing leads digital activities in 94% of companies, brand in 91% of companies. And that range of activities, when we plotted all of those out and looked at their growth and importance and the role that marketing plays over time, almost all of these things have improved, whether it's marketing analytics, lead generation, competitive intelligence, managing, revenue growth, for example. These all showed an increased role for marketing within the organization.
I mean, for the listeners, we'll obviously post a link to the results of the CMO survey, so you'll be able to look at the actual numbers on each of the charts that goes into this. But I thought it was fascinating, Christine, that you're looking at 24 different topics on which a marketer could be taking a role, and 19 of those 24 actually we've got an increase versus the previous survey in terms of how much responsibility marketers are taking. So this role is increasing, and also the importance, it seems, to the business is increased. And I think that was reflected in what you saw about presence at earnings calls and board meetings. Could you talk a little about that?
Yes, this is more good news. This is the first time we've asked a question about the importance that marketing leaders play in these kind of activities within public companies. So we asked specifically, how often is the senior marketing leader asked by the CEO or the CFO to participate in board meetings or earnings calls? And what we find is that on a 7-point scale, where 7 is all of the time and 1 is not at all, we said that the numbers are 4.9, for example, for board meetings, which means that in more than the majority of time, marketers are involved. In fact, for board meetings, marketers are there 43% of the time in the responses that we received. It's a little weaker for earnings calls. The score was only 3.6, but these numbers are very respectable, and they suggest that marketers are getting that seat at the table, that they are getting the strategic exposure that their role really should command.
That's interesting, because a lot of the broader media present this case for marketing's power in business actually declining, and yet we're seeing from those who are actually doing it that the role of marketing is as important now, and probably more encompassing than it's ever been before. I really like the fact that you'll see in the survey there's a difference between the smaller companies and the bigger companies, the companies that are selling more on the net and the companies that are selling less on the internet. And there's types of sector. Again, in the link that we paste in, all of you listeners can actually dive into that data because it's very rich. But one of the other things that impressed me was the notion of, we're always told that CMOs turn over very quickly, and the average length of tenure is around about 3 years. And actually, you found something slightly different, especially between big companies and little companies, in that people were staying about 5 years in general. And in a little company, you'll stay around about 7.5 years in role. But it seems to me, and my experience was that over the last, the pressures that business have faced over the last 24 months, the role of storytelling has got more important, and I think it is being recognised by boards and investors. So, Christine, what you set out to prove in 2008 is actually coming to life very clearly now in the role that marketers play. Now, one of the other things that's happened, of course, is yes, there's social and societal upheaval, but at the same time, we've got the digital transformation that everybody talks about it as if it's suddenly here, but it's been going on for almost 30 years now. And the CMO survey showed some expected results in terms of digital marketing spend, but also some interesting ones in terms of the roles that CMOs, marketing officers, and communications leaders are playing in company-wide digital transformation. Can you tell us a little on what you saw there?
Sure. So the expected part, as you mentioned, is that companies, despite making massive investments in the digital marketing transformation, are still not very far along on that journey. So, for example, we divided up, we asked marketers to rate themselves in terms of one of 4 categories. Were they in this nascent or very early stage where they're trying to visualize the transformation, or emerging, where they're building non-integrated digital elements, or integrated, where they're fully integrating those investments across the company. And then finally, more institutionalized or established, where they're really able to leverage those digital investments to drive and evaluate marketing decisions. And what we find is interesting, because we find that most companies, the majority of companies are still really at that emerging phase. They're still lagging in terms of fully integrating and institutionalizing these digital elements across the organization. So there still is work to be done. I think that's the expected part. The unexpected part was, frankly, the role that marketing is playing in the digital transformation. We see, for example, I noted earlier that marketing is responsible for digital marketing activities in 94% of companies, and they have led the digital transformation in 73% of companies. So not only are they in charge of it, but they sort of helped make it happen. And I think that goes back to, you used the word storytelling earlier, and the way that I understand that word is that marketers are able to sort of illuminate the black box. And what do I mean by that? Meaning they're able to tell the story based on their insights about customers, about what's really going on, in terms of what customers want and need, how they're responding to various company activities, what would be the optimal level of spending to get a better set of responses from customers. And so I think marketers really do bring that customer point of view. And frankly, who else would you want to lead the way in which digital marketing operates within an organization if it weren't a leader who really understands the customer? Because the customer is, the ultimate target for and recipient of all of the digital marketing activities that the company engages in.
And it's interesting, again, to illuminate the survey. It's divided into business to business, business to consumer, and it's about products and service companies. And we'll see a variation, but actually there was a massive, I thought, a massive kind of similarity between all types of companies in just this expression of the CMO, the marketing officer, being responsible for the way the consumer interacts with the company in a world that's now both in real life and in digital life. So I thought that was super interesting. And we also saw, of course, along with this, an increase in digital spending. So how did your CMOs report the changes in that spending? And what are they doing with the money in digital? Is it about elevating the customer experience, as you said, or is it about driving more specific business goals?
So when we asked about marketing spending, I'm going to share with your listeners both overall marketing spending and digital marketing spending. And here you can really see where digital marketing is beginning to take over a very large part of the budget. So overall marketing spending grew by about 5.2% last year, and it's expected to grow by about 13.4% in the next year. Digital marketing spending, on the other hand, grew by 15.8% in the last year, and is expected to grow by 14.7% in the next year. And so there we see basically, again, the direction that most companies are going. And when we asked in the February 2021 survey, which I'll reference here, we asked about the contributions that digital marketing can make to company performance. And the senior marketers that participate in the survey reported a 33% increase in those contributions. So that is a sizable contribution. And where is it that contribution came from? I think there's probably two areas that they reported to us. One is building better customer-facing digital interfaces. So 74% told us that. The second is transforming the company's go-to-market business model. Another 50% reported that. Those were the big strategic activities that companies have engaged in over the last year. And I think, again, that's where marketing can play an important role. There are other ways that we measured this in the most recent survey when we asked about how marketers thought digital marketing can help the company. And the biggest response was around driving business outcomes, for example, increased revenue, sales, profit, and things like that. And then secondarily, shaping marketing communications. We can come back to this. I think it's important to realize that digital may not drive things directly in all companies. In some it will. In others, it will basically help fill the top of the funnel. So maybe we can turn back to that as a sort of a question and something for marketers to think about. And then lastly, just looking again at some of these digital marketing investments, it was really interesting to me and a bit surprising that 77% of companies focused on optimizing their website, which I guess in my own thinking I had seen as really kind of like table stakes, that you've got to get the website right, but that's not really where the action is in terms of digital marketing. But that did dominate the lists in terms of the way in which marketers were using their digital investments. And that was followed by digital media and search at 69%. The one area that was much lower, and we can come back to, there's two areas. One is online experimentation at only 46%, and then machine learning and automation at 26%. So those numbers were, again, I expected that that's where marketers would be basically putting their foot on the pedal to sort of get ahead strategically. But it looks like there's still work to be done in terms of getting the website right.
I think that's a super interesting point. Let's go to the last thing you mentioned, the experimentation and the machine learning. That surprised me as well, that it was so low. And you can see in the reports, some sectors are doing better than others. So for instance, in A/B testing, experimentation with digital, 80% of CPGs say that's what they're using it for. And of course, with AI, it seems to be more like the tech companies. The other thing that struck me, Christine, was that nascent phase, when we look at a year ago versus today, everybody's moved to being more developed. So I think we're around about 8% of companies that now say they're nascent, but it was a multiple of that number just a year ago. So it seems that progress is making. And then one note of optimism, I guess, for our listeners is that when marketing directors and chief marketing officers and chief CCOs were asked the question, what do you think is going to happen to your marketing budget next year? I think we predicted a 13.2% rise in overall marketing budgets. And ever the optimists, if it grows that much, we'll be surprised. But there is growth in marketing budgets, and that spend is starting to be developed. Now, inside the digital ecosystem, I thought it was very interesting when you asked about, the power of social and the power of mobile, both of which were increasing. Social spend was around about 15% of budgets, but predicted to grow to 24% in the next 5 years. Mobile spend, 18% of budget, predicted to grow to 34%. And, there was real investment there and real opportunity for growth, especially, when you think about business driving revenue short-term performance goals. But you asked the question about, how did it contribute to business? And I think you saw something quite interesting there. So what's your thinking on that?
This is a question we've been asking for a number of years now. And this is probably, quote unquote, the bad news, which is that when we look at how social and mobile are contributing to company performance, that contribution has stayed very modest over time. We asked marketing leaders to rate these contributions on a 7-point scale, where 1 is not at all and 7 is very highly. And the numbers really are in the 3 range for social and 4 range for mobile, despite the fact that, as you said, we're seeing monumental growth in these expenditures over time. So why do you think, what do you think is at the heart of this gap? I'd like to ask you, as somebody who's been in the seat of a marketing leader, what do you think is causing this gap?
Well, I think there's 2 things. Number one, I think we're getting much better at knocking on the door at the right moment to try and make a sale. But I think we've lost a little of the art of working out what we say when the door gets open for us. So I think we've invested so much in the delivery system and trying to understand the tech stack and the way that we are targeting the right person at the right time and at the lowest possible cost. And I think we've done that at the expense of working out the creativity, the storytelling, as I call it. So the ability to get noticed has got infinitely better. Our capability of then getting a sale or a commitment from a customer or a consumer engagement around it, I think has perhaps declined. So that's one. I think the second thing about it is the economics of doing this at scale. When you are a very big company and doing this at scale, I don't believe the economics are quite as powerful as the digital ecosystem promised us 10 years ago. We were going to reduce waste and get rid of all the stuff that we didn't need to pay for, and targeting would be so efficient that our return on investment, and you've got such a huge history, Christine, in measuring marketing effect. I think as we started to measure it, maybe we're using the wrong systems, but as we're measuring it, it hasn't had the ROI impact that we really wanted. So storytelling, and I was thinking just a little about whether or not we're getting the bang for the buck in this space. And I think that's actually linked, Christine, to my next question, which is, yes, we're going to see increases in marketing spend, but I thought there was a lovely little nugget in there that for the first time in a decade almost, we're going to see some growth in traditional advertising spending. Share some of the numbers with us and give me your point of view about whether that is related to the two things I just said, tech stack and the economics and storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was such a surprising finding for us. We've been asking about various types of marketing spending over this, since 2008. And one of them is what we call quote unquote traditional advertising spending. So this is the non-digital version, although most of these things show up in some digital form, like coming through Netflix or podcasts and things. But they can also be radio, mail, direct mail, things like that. What we have seen, the very first time I think we measured this was 2011, where there was a 1.3% growth rate expected in the next year for this traditional advertising spending. Every year and every period since then that we've asked this question, the numbers have shown us negative growth. So we've seen that basically, it's been like between 0.5 and negative 0.5, or excuse me, negative 0.5 and negative 5% growth rate over this decade. But really for this first time, we saw a 1.4% positive growth rate in traditional advertising. So the question is, as you said, why? We're thinking about this a lot right now, trying to gather our own thoughts to write something about it. But the one is, of course, what's happening with the sunsetting of third-party cookies. It's going to make it much more difficult to use some of these digital tools to reach people in a personalized way. So marketers might be thinking about other ways to reach customers. I think the other is, look what's happening with podcasts. I know for me, it's a neat way to learn things. There's a lot of activity going on. And if you listen to podcasts, what you'll see is that very traditional companies are advertising on those podcasts. I was listening to one the other day, and Exxon was one of the advertisers, which really surprised me. And because usually you see kind of, new entrepreneurs and, things that are, again, that where it's maybe a cheap way to get exposure. But many of these podcasts have huge followings. So those are, I think the clutter aspect is one thing, and then the difficulty of personalizing messages is probably another. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's they're really good points. I thought this was fascinating because for a while, I don't think it's about how much you spend on digital or how much you spend on traditional. I think it's about what's the job you've got to do and what's the best way of getting it done. And I always love the David Ogilvy quote that, the best advertising presents the most persuasive selling message. So that's the storytelling, which I think we've got to get back to. All the rest of it was media to the largest number of the right people at the right time in the right way at the lowest possible cost. And as you said, Christine, the right people following a podcast are kind of self-electing, as it were. It's not like watching primetime TV. The lowest possible cost, yes, it may be cheap, but it may be incredibly effective as well. So you get a return on your money. So I think we are seeing this kind of more thoughtful approach to where a marketer spends their money and spreads the story. Again, in the survey, you'll see some information about measuring short-term impact versus the difficulty of proving long-term effect. And this notion of brand building, I think, will start coming back. But I do think the survey, and the power of this survey is its longitudinal effect, seeing the changes. And we're starting to see early signs, I think, of perhaps a change in what the marketer is also having to do. Think about brand building and think about short-term performance. Think about this afternoon, but think about next Christmas and the holiday season. And actually, with that growth in spending and this growth in opportunity and this growth in all the places you could spend your money, there seems to be more pressure on proving where you should spend your money. So it also seems there's increasing pressure on marketers to prove the worth of marketing. So how's this manifesting, and how do CMOs think about this and how they're managing it? What metrics are being deemed to be the most robust to prove the value of marketing?
Well, this is an area that I think marketers care a lot about. And maybe just to provide one other metric that seems to be one of the most popular metrics associated with the CMO survey, what we report is that marketing spending as a function of overall company revenues, and also marketing spending as a function of overall company budgets. So those numbers look like the following for your listeners, which is that marketing spending is on average about 12% of the overall company budget and about 8.6% of company revenues. So those are helpful, I think, to marketers who are trying to make a case for spending. And then again, as you mentioned, you could go and look in the firm and industry breakout report for if you're a software company or a healthcare company or a retailer and find out what those numbers look like for your sectors. But here's the problem, as you mentioned, which is that marketers are reporting increased pressure from both CEOs and CFOs to prove the value of marketing. And this is a perennial problem, as you know, in your work. It's something that non-marketing leaders, they want to know that the spending is going to good use. And one of the things that I've written about, and we'll post a link to this Harvard Business Review article in the show notes for your listeners, which is that the tendency to not have the patience for that longer term effect, and to focus really that the CEO and the CFO are often focused more on the short run effect of marketing, as if you could click your fingers and the effect of marketing would show up tomorrow. And sometimes it does if you drop a coupon or you do something very dramatic. But often marketing is a long-term game where you're building the brand and you're telling the story, as you said. So what we asked about in this most recent survey, and the details can be found both in the article and in the reports, is what should marketers do? What is it that marketers can do to improve the way in which they are able to demonstrate returns, and also to facilitate that patience for the long run. So we talk about, for example, building a business partnership with CFOs, which only happens about 35% of the time, we report, which is really a problem because that's a key relationship in terms of budgeting. And that relationship has to be fostered. CMOs or the senior marketing leader needs to meet with that CFO regularly, and often outside of regular senior management meetings, so they can explain their hypothesis, connect things to the business strategy. That's one thing. And then the second thing that I mentioned earlier is to really try to create a full funnel view of marketing to show, where is it that marketing is affecting different aspects of consumer behavior. And if you know that, for example, if you're Berkshire Hathaway and you're deciding how to invest in Geico, you know that you have to create a lot of awareness at the top. So you spend, because that's what's ultimately going to produce impact when we get all the way down to the bottom of that funnel. And then finally, just the idea of really fostering that investment mentality. It's easy to think about marketing as an expense, but when you look at the evidence, which is substantial in the academic literature on marketing in particular, there's very strong reasons to believe that marketing has a very long-term effect on the brand and customer satisfaction, and that this will have very important financial impacts for the organization, not just for marketing. I'll just share with you one extremely striking statistic that I always come back to, and I use it all the time when I teach because it is so profound in terms of its importance, which is there was a group of researchers that formed a portfolio of companies that perform highly on customer satisfaction. versus a group of companies that were more average. And they looked at the stock returns that were associated with the portfolio of companies that scored higher on customer satisfaction. And this was measured by the American Customer Satisfaction Index, which is publicly available data out of the University of Michigan. And what they found is that that portfolio that scored higher on customer satisfaction achieved a 518% return between 2000 and 2014, compared to a 31% return for the sort of typical market return for the S&P 500. So that's something that marketers really should be excited about, because it shows that longer term effect is incredibly important. Do you have any experience with that in your role?
Yeah, I think, well, they were three great points, Christine, and what a wonderful one to finish on. Yes, who wouldn't want a 500% return over 14 years? So we'll hold on to that thought. The point about the CFO is right. I do think you've got to put your marketing hat on when you talk to a CMO, which is not talking marketing, but understand the consumer. Your consumer, the CFO, you've got to talk business language to them. So that's true. And I do think this long-term, short-term dynamic, it's one that's fascinated me for years, because the short-term returns we were able to prove. I worked at CPG companies, and you were able to prove that the performance marketing got much better when your brand marketing was performing better. So that long-term effect had a short-term impact. Trying to get the balance right, I think, was always important. But ultimately, I believe that, the differentiation in the marketplace comes down to branding, pricing, great products, but ultimately, is your customer and your consumer satisfied with what you're offering and the price you're offering it at and the experience that they have? And Christine, we talked about the idea of measurement and how a marketer's thinking about measuring short-term, long-term effects, sales revenue generation versus long-term brand health.
Well, we asked these questions in the most recent survey. In fact, we asked marketers to rate 26 different marketing metrics in terms of how frequently they're used and how frequently they're basically measured. And what we found was actually pretty astonishing, which is that the top 7 metrics were all around sales and revenue, digital web and mobile performance, lead generation, things like that. Despite the importance of what you just said earlier about brand and customer satisfaction, these were the least used metrics by organizations. So, for example, the very bottom of the measurement scale was brand equity value, was at 3%. Measures of brand differentiation, 4%, in terms of how consistently they were being measured within the organization and used. Same thing with the customer profitability and lifetime value, a little bit larger, but still only about 8%. So the point is that, it is cliche to say what gets managed is measured or measured is managed, but these two correlate. The more important thing is also what we're communicating about marketing. What is marketing's role within the organization? Is it just for sales and digital engagement, or is it also for building these important assets in the form of customer relationships and brand equity, which I think we both agree it probably needs to be focused on those as well. Otherwise, we have a very limited role for marketing within the organization.
Yes, it's not an either or, it's an and the power of that and is what we can unlock. So thank you. Great point, Christine. So, Christine, I'd like to thank you. You don't often get professors who are this profound, being able to talk about real world things that are impacting the business that marketers have to face, leaders in marketing and communications face every day. So I'd urge you all to look at the show notes, go and download the report. But probably more importantly, I need you all to ask your CMO to take part in this survey, because you can see, as Christine said, it's independent, it's very rich, it's very useful, and it puts apart a few chapters of our story as marketers together for us, but more importantly, proves some facts that means that those stories will be carrying some weight. So, Christine, thank you very much for joining us. Fascinating talk. Everybody read Christine's HBR piece as well, because it's brilliant. So thank you, Christine. And with that, we shall say adieu.
Thank you very much, Ivan. It was a pleasure to be with you today.
This has been Influencers from the Conference Board.